Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome back to another one of our video lessons. Today we're going to be talking about the United States and the end of the Great War. So just to recap, where we're at in 1916, after 2 years of war, is we're in the stalemate. There's a stalemate along the Western Front in France. There's really heavy casualties back and forth, but no actual progress. The United States, when this war breaks out, declares neutrality and decides it does not want to be involved in a European war. But while the United States is trying to stay out, the war is spreading slowly but surely into the rest of the world. Bombing raids on civilians, the invasion of Turkey in the Middle East in the Gallipoli campaign, unrestricted submarine warfare in all of the oceans, threatening trade, and two full-on fronts, the Eastern Front in France and the Western Front in Russia. So the war is picking up by the time the United States is going to even get involved. So just to review the alliances, at this point it is Great Britain, France, Italy, and Russia until they're going to leave, and then eventually the United States, when they come in, they're going to be on the side of the Allied powers. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, are going to remain the same until all three of these governments collapse by 1918. So just in terms of visualizing this, when we talk about the Western Front, it's a big front, 440 miles stretching all the way from the English Channel, all the way down to France, kind of all the way past several forests. And so this is a very large front. Millions of people are fighting on this, and almost no territory is going to change places. Almost all the fighting in the war happens along this line. So a particularly interesting event that happened in 1914 was an event called the Christmas Truce. That on Christmas Day, 1914, the soldiers decided that they were not going to fight. And so they called a truce in which the people came out of their trenches, they exchanged chocolates and food, and they laughed. And so it was this interesting idea where in civilized world, right, in the world of civilization and refinement and aristocracy and wealth, you can't fight on Christmas. And so this is civilization, that idea of that we cannot fight on Christmas. And so a lot of historians call this the last gasp of civilization in Europe, because it's the last time that soldiers will put aside, or the countries will put aside anything, because it is the right thing to do for civilization, for culture, for anything else. And so the Christmas Truce kind of becomes this really iconic moment that it is the vestiges, the holdovers from what the world was, but by the next year, 1915, they're fighting on Christmas, and that world of civilization has gone, and we're now just in the world of war. So the Christmas Truce spread, it's great news, it's a great story, you guys should look it up, but in the middle of this war, one time they set aside all their differences, but it would be the last time that they would do this in 1914. So from 1914 to 1917, warfare itself is going to change. Rather than trying to capture a city or a field or territory, the new goal now is what we call a war of attrition, where the goal is simply to kill as many of the enemy as possible so that they can no longer fight. This is kind of like a boxing match in which people are just standing toe-to-toe and just trying to knock each other out. Because of this, the war is going to be deadlier than any before. Disease is still a huge killer. By 1918, the Spanish influenza, a great pandemic that swept through the world, is going to take a lot of these lives. But also shelling, gas attacks, small arms fire from new highly powered rifles and machine guns, hand grenades. All of these things are really just going to ratchet up the deadliness of this war. And so as time was going on, all the sides are looking for an advantage. Poison gas, anything, a mine, digging under the trenches, anything they can come up with, they're trying to do this. But while all this is happening, the United States remains neutral. They want to stay out. So what happens then, after kind of the Western Front is established, is Germany is going to invade Russia. And so when Germany invades Russia, that opens up what we call the Eastern Front, right? It's east of Germany. And so this is going to be a great success for Germany. 2 million casualties for Russia in a very short amount of time means that the Russian people are going to start to question whether or not they should stay in the war. It's going to be very unpopular. And so Germany, sensing an opportunity, actually helps Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, who you guys know as Vladimir Lenin, they put him on a train and helped smuggle him back into Russia so that he could start a revolution, which you guys are going to know. And so peace and bread becomes the slogan of the anti-war revolutionaries, and we are now creeping more slowly to everything that's going to happen after the war. So just to take a second for technology, new weapons of war are going to be really, really influential both in this war and then especially as they become more refined in the Second World War. Trench warfare in no man's land really shows us this, that it's very difficult to even survive kind of in open combat in this war. You have machine guns, you have hand grenades, you have long range accurate artillery that can fire like miles and miles and miles away. If you are trying to attack, you have razor wire, barbed wire that could stop you, get caught up in that, and you never get out. Mines, poison gas makes its debut in World War I. You got airplanes, tanks, automobiles, submarines. And so technology has really leaped forward during the Industrial Revolution, and now it is showing itself in war. So just to kind of take a quick chemistry lesson here, modern chemistry also unleashes for us the horrors of chemical warfare. The two most commonly used were mustard gas and chlorine gas. And so that's the chemical formula for mustard gas. And chlorine gas is simply just Cl, chlorine, in gas form. Because when you inhale it, it is going to react with the moisture in your lungs and form hydrochloric acid, which essentially burns your lungs from the inside out. And so modern chemistry unleashes all these weapons, and they were used in the Iraq War by Saddam Hussein, and in the civil war that is ongoing in Syria, the Syrian government has used chlorine gas on its opposition as well as civilian populations. So we've opened up Pandora's box, and now more things that are possible are going to make the world a more deadly place to be in. So another kind of really interesting thing is the rise of airplane technology. The most famous pilot in World War I is Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron. He is the most successful flying ace of the war, and he becomes actually so famous that Snoopy, the character from Peanuts, is actually going to fly against him in a series of cartoons called Snoopy and the Red Baron. So you ever go back and watch that? That is actually a World War I homage. So all this new technology that was trying to break the trench warfare stalemate fails. Battles of Verdun and the Somme have 1 million casualties each. No ground is really won or lost, and the war is just dragging on and on. It's deadlier and deadlier. Even putting tanks out into no man's land doesn't get them very far. Tanks get attacked, they blow up, they get down in the mud, and so nothing is really breaking the stalemate. The body count is just rising higher and higher every year. And so we also then get total war, the idea that kind of the entire country is organized for the purpose of really fighting this war. Total war means that people are working in munitions factories, means people are being drafted, means people are volunteering to do all sorts of things, rationing, you can't have all of what you want. And it also is going to mean that civilians become targets of war. This begins in World War I. By World War II, it is going to be an accepted tactic to bomb a civilian city because the industry is really what gives these countries their military power. So let's dip over to the United States now that we got just a little bit of review. So the United States is really staying out of World War I at the start. Europe, it's a European problem, fought for European reasons, over European, beliefs and colonization and everything else. America is focused more close to home. They have those Latin American territories they just recently took over. They have the trade with Asia. They have the Philippines. They're fighting some wars against guerrillas in the Philippines. And so the United States really just doesn't care at the start. And in fact, America's making a lot of money because demand for everything is super high. America's not at war. America's not under attack. And so America is selling more steel and other things than ever before. So this is actually good for America's money. Also kind of complicating America's allegiance in this is our mixed population of people. There are Irish people who hate England, and so they want America to back Germany. There are Germans who obviously, want America to back Germany. The English and the Italians, they are really against the Central Powers, and racism against Germans is actually going to crop up as a big thing in this time. So the United States ultimately does a lot more business with Britain and France. And so its leadership, kind of its upper class, is going to lean that way. And when the opportunity comes, they're going to be the ones pushing to get America in on the side of the Allies, not the Central Powers. But really key to getting America off the bench into the game is going to be this. So submarine warfare is kind of new. Submarines were invented during the American Civil War, were used to very limited effect, but now we have modern submarines. And these modern submarines target, anything. They target military ships, but unrestricted submarine warfare means also targeting trade and civilian shipping. Kind of like a blockade, only instead of actually having your ships out there, you just have submarines patrolling and you blow up anything that you find after, letting the people know. So in this war of attrition, supplies could be the difference between victory and defeat. And that's why this becomes a strategy. So in the past, submarines used to surface and then demand surrender. Unrestricted submarine warfare meant no more warnings. If you were in the channel, if you were at the place at the right time, then you could be fired upon. And so there are actually several really high-profile sinking of ships that kill a number of civilians. The most famous of these is May 7th of 1915, the Lusitania. So a Syrma submarine, this is off the coast of Ireland, 2 torpedoes hit the Lusitania and it begins to sink. Some people make it off the boat, but over 1,000 people are going to die, either aboard or drowning afterwards. And among those 1,000 were 128 Americans. So now all of a sudden America is outraged, right? And so Americans are going to start to push. We need to get in there, avenge the Lusitania, right? And so Germany is actually fearing this. They actually pause for a while, this unrestricted submarine warfare, and they kind of apologize to America, saying we weren't targeting you. And so for a brief period of time, kind of the outrage about the Lusitania diminishes slightly. But Americans are going to start to view Germany as the bad guys in this war because of the Lusitania. So here's the New York Times New York Times headline for the day. So after about taking a year and a half off from unrestricted submarine warfare, Germany feels like they need to do it in order to break the stalemate, in order to wear down Britain, in order to force a surrender, that really controlling the seas was the important thing. So Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare, much to the outrage of the United States and other neutral countries around the world. But what really is going to bring America in is going to be Arthur Zimmermann, the foreign minister of Germany's telegram to Mexico. And Zimmermann sent a coded secret telegram to Mexico saying this: "We intend to begin on the first day of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor in spite of this to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event of this not succeeding, we make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer its lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona." So, if you weren't reading that or listening, this is Germany offering Mexico an alliance against the United States. And so the Zimmermann telegram becomes the main reason the United States gets involved in World War I. It was a secret telegram, it was decoded by British intelligence, and even though Mexico said no, remember, this is the 19-teens. Mexico had just gone through their revolution, and so things are kind of unstable in Mexico at the time. And so Britain tells the United States about it. To the United States, they see this as an act of war. You are trying to get somebody to attack us, and so the United States debates then, should we go to war with Germany? And on April 2nd, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson says that the United States, with the declaration of war from the Congress, is going to enter into the First World War. So when Woodrow Wilson announces that the United States is going to war after Congress votes for it, it's a really, really tough sell, right? He's the salesman, he's got to sell it to everyone. On its surface, it's like, okay, we're going to war over the Zimmermann telegram and the Lusitania, which isn't a whole lot if you're going to try to get a whole country to go fight a war over there in Europe when they think it might not affect them. So Woodrow Wilson came up with an idea. America was not fighting for the Lusitania. America was not fighting for the Zealand Telegram. America was fighting for world peace. And so in order to achieve world peace, Woodrow Wilson comes up with 14 points, 14 kind of like demands that we'll get this after the war, and then world peace will be achieved. Super idealistic, self-determination for every people within an empire, disarmament, free navigation of the seas. But really the point of this is that he's trying to give America a cause to fight for. Like Abraham Lincoln before him, and really most presidents, he needs to change the meaning of the war to make it something that Americans will get behind and will be willing to sacrifice for. And so remember, America's fighting for world peace. So says Woodrow Wilson. So at home in the United States, the whole country mobilizes, organizes around the war. The military draft, selective service, drafts millions of men into the Army. The War Industries Board is created to coordinate all of these giant companies so that they work together so America has everything it needs for the war. Rationing went into place. You couldn't get all the food, fuel, silk was especially very hard to find, and so you were limited because it was wartime and things had to be saved for the war. Also, the government sold war bonds, asking people to give money to the government for victory or for liberty. And so the government raised a lot of money from ordinary Americans investing in the war. But probably one of the biggest consequences of this was actually the workforce expansion. Women who were already working in large numbers, as you guys know from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, women are working in even larger numbers than ever before. And that is going to affect a lot of things, including the 1919 amendment in order to give women the right to vote. Right after this war, women get the right to vote. Also, too, the Great Migration is really going to change demographics in the United States. A lot of Black Americans fleeing Jim Crow segregation, violence, they simply leave the South and they go to northern industrial cities where there are jobs. There's jobs in Chicago, there's jobs in Detroit, there's jobs in New York, there's jobs in Philly. And so that's where people go. They go where they're going to find work. However, as we're going to learn about, those situations, oftentimes in northern cities like Chicago, they face just as big of discrimination as they do in a lot of these places. But work opportunities, economic opportunities, that's why people move. And then this is also the beginning of the large Mexican-American population in a lot of these northern cities as well. In what the United States called the Bracero programs, over 100,000 of these Mexican immigrants came into the United States, moved to places like Chicago, Los Angeles, kind of these big industrial cities, and they worked and they stayed, and that's kind of the start of a lot of these communities kind of growing in the United States. So just in terms of the map, this will maybe help you see kind of where people are coming from and where they end up. And so especially when we talk about even places like Denver, Colorado has a really large immigrant population. A lot of that actually comes from this time. You kind of see as people make their way to where there is work. So women also get involved in a lot of different ways, and we're going to read a bunch about this. But one that I thought was kind of interesting was the Women's Land Army. As more and more people were drafted into the war, there was a lot of farms that no longer had people, like their owners got drafted, whatever else, and so they needed people to actually just work the land. So you could actually sign up, and pretty much you would just join with this giant group of like volunteer farmers, and you would go out and you would farm every day. And so like in every aspect of American life, people are being asked to step up in new ways. And then after the war, a lot of these groups, they're going to be asking for and demanding their full rights as Americans because of what they did during the war. It's a very important moment. And in a lot of other ways, like demographics are going to start to change. All these new immigrants we talked about, right? The Irish, Italians, Poles, Jews, Russians, really from all over the place, from all over Europe. This is where those new immigrants, they start to become American. Because once you serve with somebody from Kansas, somebody from like Texas, it really kind of changes the way Americans think about themselves. Much more as a whole people and much less as like kind of the individual ethnic or, like local allegiances, like, oh, I'm from Chicago only. And so this is a really big moment in a lot of those groups becoming, for the first time, considered to be American. Also, too, so the army is segregated. And so black and Native Americans who are going to fight in this war oftentimes serve in segregated units. The most famous of these units is going to be the Harlem Hellfighters. They have the distinction of being in the most combat in World War I of any Americans, and they serve in segregated units, and they go back to a country that discriminates against them. And so a lot of what we'll see with civil rights movements of the 1920s, even up till today, a lot of that's going to be rooted in those types of experience. That how can you tell me I am not equal after I have answered the call and served my country? And so a lot of things are going to have to change. Also, too surprisingly, American Indians, about 11,000 of them are going to sign up to fight with the United States. A lot of these people end up becoming code talkers. They talk in their Native American languages, and the Europeans could not figure it out because it wasn't based on any sort of a European language or anything like that. And so their service in the war, at the end of it, all of them were granted citizenship, previously denied to people who were American Indians. And by 1924, at the urging of this group of veterans, all American Indians are going to be given U.S. citizenship, been previously denied. And so sometimes, folks, it takes a really big upheaval, like a world war, in order for change to occur socially. So beyond just kind of how this war is shaping demographics, it's also shaping psychology. And so suspicion and paranoia are like everywhere. Like spy fever, like oh my gosh, like all of these, like there's like spies everywhere. And a lot of this ended up kind of manifesting itself in anti-German feelings and anti-German acting out. So sauerkraut, just kind of a condiment, becomes known as Liberty cabbage. All sorts of renaming of stuff. Germans who had umlauts in their names, like my family, who was Muller. We became Mueller pretty quickly in the 19-teens. Laws like the Espionage Act made it like legal, made like a lot of like anti-spy activities that were, questionable, legal. And the Sedition Act of 1918, it made it illegal to publicly criticize the war. That's the First Amendment, right? You can criticize the government doing anything. But this fear, this paranoia, really just kind of sweeps through the country, and it kind of gathers up a lot of people in it. And so we're going to read a little bit about that as well, but just this paranoia characterizes the age. And I love this. These are actually Quaker women who were speaking out against the war because they are pacifists, and they would stand outside of the White House holding a sign saying that their freedom of speech was taken away. And in fact, some people were actually put in prison for daring to criticize the war. And so again, in times of fear and paranoia, sometimes we throw out our rights, we throw out everything that's supposed to make the United States a great country. So let's get back to the war. The United States is going to go over there. It's a cool song, you should look it up, it's called Over There. And the army of 2 million people goes to France to fight. And as the United States goes in, another power actually leaves. And so we're going to tell the story real briefly about the Russian Revolution. So in 1917, the Soviet Union was losing the war very, very badly. Peace and bread was the cry of Vladimir Lenin and other revolutionaries. And so in 1917, the people of Russia rise up and they demand that the Tsar and his family abdicate the throne and leave the government to somebody else. They demand an end to the war. And so there's a little bit of street fighting, the Tsar abdicates, and now it is kind of just open in Russia to what is going to happen. But Vladimir Lenin sees an opening. He promises the people peace, land, and bread, and he immediately tries to consolidate his power for a group known as the Bolsheviks. And so the riots over, bread shortages, casualties of the front, they unseat Tsar Nicholas. But then the communists, led by Vladimir Lenin, the Bolsheviks, lead a second revolution in October. And in October, they take over the government. They immediately leave the war. But they also fear that maybe the Tsar will get back in power. So it is the Bolsheviks who execute the Tsar's entire family, and the Bolsheviks declare a new country called the Soviet Union that will be governed by them. And so Russia immediately makes peace with Germany, and they exit the war as America comes in. So once the United States is in the war, with its industry, with its population, this is going to start to tip the scales ever so slightly in favor of the Allies. But as America gets there, it's actually kind of a fun story. Colonel Charles Stanton marched his men to the grave of the Marquis de Lafayette, America's great ally in our revolution. And he marched his soldiers past his grave, and he basically said, Lafayette, we are here to honor the old alliance. And so kind of an interesting story. Americans coming to rescue France as France came to rescue the United States. So in the last years of the war, you can look up battles, but really just there's several attempts by the Germans to win the war, and all of them fail. Then there's several attempts by the American soldiers to win the war at Cantigny, the Argonne Forest. In the Argonne Forest, 600,000 U.S. soldiers fought, largest battle in American history. But neither of these groups, the Germans or the Americans, can break the stalemate. But what's happening is that once the United States is in with fresh soldiers, fresh industry, all this brand new stuff, the Central Powers start to think like, I don't know if we can win this, right? They haven't lost, but how many more years are you going to fight if you don't think you can win? And so the Central Powers all began to fall apart. There's a revolution in Austria-Hungary that unseats the Emperor Franz Joseph. The Ottoman Empire surrenders to a group of Arab states and tribes that had united with the British in order to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. There's a film about it called Lawrence of Arabia. You can check it out. And then in Germany, the final straw is that there is a revolution that unseats Kaiser Wilhelm. And so these three new governments, they immediately start seeking an end to the war. And so in fall of 1918, Germany is the last country that has not surrendered. Kaiser Wilhelm had to step down. And so the Germans finally decided, though they have not lost the war, that they cannot win the war. And so they ask for an armistice. An armistice is a ceasefire where no one is going to fight anymore. So Germany is not defeated, but they don't think they can win. And so peace talks are held in France. And so the generals of the armies sat down on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. That's November 11th, which you guys know is Memorial Day. They signed the armistice that ended World War I. In a strange twist of fate, Adolf Hitler will later find this same rail car to make France surrender to the Nazis. So once the military combat is over, the treaty has to actually be negotiated. Otherwise, countries are going to go back to war. So at Versailles in France, this big treaty that's going to reshape the world is negotiated. And it's primarily negotiated by these four men. Woodrow Wilson, United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, and George Clemenceau so those names are all over the wrong people, but George Clemenceau is the one with the mustache in the middle, to the left of Wilson. But the real key here, though, is who is not in the room. The Allies pretty much meet without the Central Powers in there at all. These are the German delegation, and they are just sitting in their own room. And so what you end up having is a treaty where only one side is going to be involved. And so the negotiations, they go very poorly. The Allied powers act like they had unconditional victory. They want to punish Germany. Germany is like not giving any input. But these guys, these leaders, like this big four of the United States, Italy, France, and Britain, they just believe that the Germans, they don't want the war, so they'll take whatever terms are on offer. And so Woodrow Wilson, for his money, he barely gets any of his world peace 14-point stuff in there. And so this is going to be really disappointing for America, who fights a war and then feels they get nothing out of it but blood and lost money. And so here's what they come up with. There's almost no 14 points in there. So Americans are going to be pretty upset because they're like, well, we fought for this, then we didn't get any of it. But really the core parts of this, first is the part that is going to mess with Germany. So Germany has all these conditions that are really harsh. They have to accept responsibility for the war. They have to disarm their army and not build a new one. They have to give up a bunch of land. And the big one is like they have to pay reparations, $442 billion worth of reparations to the Allies for the guilt of starting the war. Well, if you're a country recovering from a war and you have to pay a bunch of money to other people, you're going to have a Great Depression really fast in Germany. And so the Germans see this as punishing them. And this creates a lot of anger in Germany. And so the political changes are really going to upset the whole world. Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, German Empire just don't exist anymore. And they ruled at one time a huge piece of the world. There's also like brand new countries created by different ethnicities, self-determination of peoples. We have like Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. There's like dozens of new countries that are being created. And so it's going to be very unstable in the world over the next 20 years. And so looking at this map, you can just kind of see how many new countries are going to be created out of these old empires. And so people in those empires, it's going to be a very interesting time to try to piece together how is the new government going to work, how are these countries going to relate to each other, and so it's setting us up for a future where there's going to be a lot of difficulty. In the Middle East, even though a group of Arab tribes pretty much just revolted against the Ottoman Empire in Turkey and pretty much defeated them, the British and French decided that they were not going to honor their agreement. Britain promised that the Arabs would be independent, that there would be an independent Arabia, which they fought for. But Britain and France decided that they were going to keep a lot of this territory. So Turkey becomes independent, but then the British and the French draw lines on the map and say, this is Syria, this is Iraq, this is Saudi Arabia, this is Kuwait, this is Palestine, this is Lebanon. And none of these places existed before this. So a lot of the wars that are taking place in the Middle East today and over like the last 50 years, they are directly linked to the way that World War I ended and the way these maps were drawn. Because the people who live there were not consulted about how they should be drawn. And so ultimately, this peace is going to be costly. Treaty of Versailles creates kind of terrible conditions in like the Middle East, in Germany, and in Germany especially, poverty and inflation, anger, really gives rise to, I guess you call it a conspiracy theory called the stab in the back. That the soldiers had won the war, but they were betrayed by the government at home. That the government at home betrayed them. And especially the leadership of the new government that were Jewish, because they weren't loyal to Germany. And so that's where we begin to see the Nazi ideology grow. And ultimately, this government's going to take over. It's called the Weimar Republic. It's going to be very, very weak and unable to defend itself from all sorts of street violence and eventually a takeover by the Nazi Party. So the one interesting thing that does come out of Treaty of Versailles is the League of Nations. This is like the forerunner of the United Nations, which will be created after World War II. And its goals were lofty, to actually prevent war. That's his goal, to actually have world peace. But for all of America, so America proposed this idea that America did not join it. Woodrow Wilson went from town to town saying, we got to join this, we got to join this. Like, we have to be in the League of Nations so we can create world peace. But Americans were upset about the Treaty of Versailles. They were upset about the war. And so the United States basically just said, like, why do we want to get in alliances and get dragged into another European war? And so the Senate refused to ratify the treaty, and the United States never joined the League of Nations, ever. So to put a wrap on this, I just want to talk a little bit about the end of the war and what it meant. So in the United States, the war has a lot of effects. It destroys the economies in Europe because the war is fought there, but in America, it's the boom. The 1920s boom, like the Roaring '20s, it is just World War I. It is the growth of World War I and the wealth creates the 1920s. We also get the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. Huge worldwide revolution, first communist revolution, and this creates in America a Red Scare. Like, are people trying to do communist revolutions inside of the United States? The industrial demands of the war were actually really, really big because they caused people to move. And they also brought a lot of new people into industries that they previously had not. And so economically, this war changed just about everything about the way that Americans are going to live. And then ultimately, just like the sacrifices of wartime, disappointment with the ending, the United States decides to stay out of everything that happens up until, the 1930s and really past that. So America doesn't come into World War II until 3 years in. And so that tells you just how disappointed Americans were with their adventure in Europe. In terms of the world, the United States emerges now as a world power. They kind of pretended at one, right, with imperialism, but now it is real. No world discussion will happen without America being considered. The world map is redrawn in ways that we are still dealing with today. The Soviet Union rises up, and by the end of World War II, will become the second most powerful country in the world. And all these royals, their empires, they're all gone. Germany, Russia, Ottoman, Austria-Hungary, Belgium. There's a dozen monarchs that were in power before the war that are gone after it. The human cost is hard to calculate. About 10 million dead, 21 million casualties. We don't really know how many civilians died, so it could be much higher than that. 7 million people permanently disabled, crippled, shell-shocked, post-traumatic stress disorder, mental illness caused by the stress of battle. We read about that in All Quiet on the Western Front. Like, that takes a toll on a lot of people too. The Ottoman Empire carries out the first, what we call genocide in the modern era with the Armenians. And largely no one talks about the Armenians. It was a huge loss. And really just this entire generation that experiences the war, it changes the way they think about everything in their lives. And we end up calling them the lost generation because they are lost. So the Armenian genocide foreshadows everything that's going to come. Kind of very, very brutal pictures, but this is the world in which we live now. That lost generation of soldiers, crippled emotionally, crippled spiritually, crippled physically, are going to have to pick up the pieces after this war. And so Samuel Hines described it as a generation of young men, their heads full of high abstractions like honor, glory, and England, went off the war to make the world safe for democracy. They were slaughtered in stupid battles planned by stupid generals. Those who survived were shocked, disillusioned, and embittered by their war experiences and saw that their real enemies were not the Germans, but the old men at home who had lied to them. They rejected the values of the society that sent them to war, and in doing so separated their own generation from the past and from their cultural inheritance. And so people begin to reject tradition, because tradition caused the war. And so the loss of lives, just this disillusionment with everything, with authorities, with your parents' world, it leaves a void. Because if you're not connected to your past, then new ideas, new ideologies are going to crop up. People are changed by the war. It's the death of civilization. No longer will people say, oh, we are civilized. That's going to die. In fact, one of the most popular toasts in World War I was to the death of civilization. There's also aimlessness. If you feel everybody lied to you, then what do you believe? And so cynicism crops up, the indulgence of the roaring 20s. And so this group is going to be so different than the generation behind them because of this war experience. And I think Hemingway captures it well. They wrote in the old days it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. But in modern war, there's nothing sweet nor fitting in your dying. You will die like a dog for no good reason. And he also wrote that if people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them, and so of course it kills them. The world breaks every one, and afterwards many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. And so it's that worldview that is going to characterize the 1920s. And so World War I is the direct cause of World War II. There's no lasting peace. the rise of the Nazis in Germany. Fear of war leads to appeasement as the Nazis slowly spread out. The League of Nations fails to keep the peace. And ultimately, we have 20 years of halftime between the First World War and the outbreak of World War II. They're going to be the same wars fought for the same reasons. And so we have the making of the 20th century. We now have terrorism, industrial warfare, genocide, weapons of mass destruction, death of civilization, the fall of empires, the death of the values and the traditions of the past. And you have emerging new powers in the Soviet Union and the United States. So ultimately, by the 1930s, the world would once again slip into war, from the Spanish Civil War to the invasion of Poland. But World War I, more than probably any other event around it, shaped the world in which you live.